When the judge uttered that number, the courtroom froze. $500 million? The sound of it didn't just echo through the walls, it tore through the hearts of everyone watching. It wasn't a fine. It wasn't even a punishment. It was a declaration of war. Judge Thomas sat back, eyes heavy with authority, as if daring Jasmine Crockett to flinch, daring her to show weakness before the world. And for a heartbeat, the silence was unbearable. Reporters' pens hovered in midair, camera shutters stopped clicking, even the jurors shifted in disbelief. A congresswoman, a public servant, a daughter of the people buried beneath a number. So outrageous it could cripple a nation, let alone a single woman. In that instant, the air thickened with something darker than shock. It was fear. Not just for Jasmine's career, but for what this fine symbolized. $500 million wasn't about justice. It was about intimidation. It was about making an example out of her, punishing her audacity to stand, to speak, to represent. Voices that Judge Thomas and his ilk wished would remain silent. To them, this was more than a verdict. It was a warning shot aimed at anyone who dared challenge the established order. Whispers erupted in the gallery. Did he really say 500 million? One voice trembled. Another hissed. He's trying to erase her. Social media notifications buzzed in the back pockets of aides and observers, already lighting up with disbelief. Hashtags were being born before the echoes of the gavel had even faded. But inside those four walls, the weight of silence pressed hardest on Jasmine herself. Her name, her work, her legacy, all of it, hung on this moment, this absurd figure. Designed to crush her into dust, most would have collapsed under it. Most would have looked down, defeated, humiliated by the scale of what had just been handed down. Judge Thomas expected nothing less. That was the trap, an outrageous punishment. Engineered not only to destroy but to humiliate, to shatter the spirit of a woman who dared to resist. All eyes shifted to her, waiting for the fall, waiting for the tears, the breakdown, the end of her story. $500 million. That figure didn't just linger in the courtroom. It rippled outward like a shockwave, striking at the very heart of what justice is supposed to mean in America. Judge Thomas called it discipline, a stiff reminder that no one, not even a congresswoman, is above the law. His defenders framed it as proof of his iron hand, his unwillingness to tolerate what he described as Crockett's disrespect for the institution. But to critics, to those watching with eyes wide and blood boiling, it wasn't discipline at all. It was a vendetta. It was punishment disguised as principle. Retribution wrapped in legalese because, let's be clear, $500 million is not a fine, it's annihilation. It's financial execution. No ordinary citizen, no public servant, no elected official could withstand that blow. The sheer absurdity of it stripped away any illusion of fairness. It wasn't about money. It was about erasure. The message was unmistakable. Step out of line, speak too boldly. Refuse to bow your head and you will be crushed. For Jasmine Crockett, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Reputation was on the line. Her career teetered on the edge. Of ruin, her legacy ready to be rewritten by a man who believed the bench gave him godlike authority. The headlines were already being drafted in real time. Crockett crushed by record fine. Pundits speculated on her future. Would she resign? Would this mark the end of her once rising star? Would she fade into the long list of women and people of color silenced by the system when they dared to shine too brightly? Where supporters sat in stunned disbelief. Some clasped their hands together, whispering prayers. Others stared straight ahead, unwilling to blink, willing to see the fall of someone who had come to symbolize their own fight for dignity. Across the nation, millions who had never even stepped foot in that courtroom felt the sting. For them, Jasmine wasn't just one congresswoman. She was every daughter of immigrants, every voice dismissed as too loud, every fighter told they should stay in their place. And now, it looked as though the place she was being sent to was exile political, financial, and personal. But the story wasn't over. In fact, the seeds of something greater were already being planted in that very moment. Because what Judge Thomas didn't realize was that his heavy-handed punishment, his attempt to silence Jasmine forever, would become the very spark that turned the entire court and, eventually the country against him. The fine wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a reversal, so stunning, so unthinkable, that even his allies would be left scrambling to explain it. And as Jasmine's eyes lifted from the desk to meet his, calm and unbroken, a sense of unease began to stir not in her, but in him. The fine was supposed to end her career. Instead, it would ignite something he could never control. Asterisk for decades. Judge Thomas cultivated an image of dignity draped in robes. To the casual observer, he was the embodiment of judicial restraint, silver-haired, stern-faced, his voice carrying the cadence of authority honed by years on the bench. Law school brochures had once cited his early rulings as models of discipline and clarity. Journalists praised him as a figure of stability in turbulent times. He liked that reputation. He leaned on it, wore it like armor, and often reminded colleagues and clerks that he had seen it all and knew the law better than anyone in this town. Yet behind that polished exterior lay a man who had grown far too comfortable with unchecked power. The same gavel that once struck in fairness had slowly become a weapon, a symbol of his own ego. Thomas no longer saw himself as a referee of justice, but as its sole architect, entitled to bend the scales in whatever direction suited him. Where younger judges humbled themselves before precedent, Thomas twisted precedent to fit his whims. Where others sought balance, he sought dominance. He relished the stage. Each courtroom session was, in his mind, a performance, and he was the star. Witnesses recalled how he smirked when delivering harsh sentences, as though savoring the gasps from onlookers. Attorneys whispered about how he belittled them in front of their clients, turning trials into spectacles of humiliation. To Thomas, authority wasn't a responsibility, it was a throne, and hypocrisy trailed him like a shadow. In speeches, he preached about equal justice under the law. Yet his rulings betrayed a pattern: deference to the powerful, disdain for the outspoken. He had been lenient toward corporate executives who funneled money through back channels, merciless toward activists who dared disrupt the status quo. He publicly scolded politicians for corruption. Even as rumors swirled about his private meetings with donors and power brokers, the robe was supposed to symbolize impartiality. But with Thomas, it became a cloak to hide the contradictions he never admitted. Those who worked close to him saw the arrogance up close. He dismissed junior clerks with a wave of the hand if their research didn't align with his desired outcome. He interrupted lawyers mid-sentence, declaring, "I've heard enough," long before arguments were finished. He told colleagues on the bench that he was the last line of defense against chaos, a phrase that revealed more about his own fears than about any legal principle. Over time, Thomas stopped being a judge who interpreted the law, became a man convinced he was the law, and perhaps that is why he overplayed his hand with Jasmine Crockett. To him, she was not a congresswoman representing thousands of voices, not a public servant with a record of defiance against injustice. To Thomas, she was just another loud figure to be cut down to size, another reminder that the courtroom was his domain, not theirs. When he issued that $500 million fine, he believed it would cement his authority, silence a rising star, and serve as a cautionary tale to anyone else who dared defy him. In his mind, it was the perfect strike: ruthless, theatrical, final. Arrogance always blinds the villain to their own vulnerability. What Thomas failed to recognize was that the very traits he despised in Jasmine, her resolve, her refusal to bow, her ability to connect with people, were the traits that would turn the courtroom against him. The more he tried to humiliate her, the more people noticed the cracks in his facade. The longer he leaned on intimidation, the clearer it became that his gavel wasn't backed by respect, but by fear. And fear, once pierced, collapses quickly. In that room, when he declared $500 million as punishment, he thought the gallery would nod in awe. Instead, they gasped in disbelief. He mistook silence for obedience, when in truth, it was the first sign of doubt. He mistook Jasmine's stillness for surrender, when in truth, it was the calm before a storm he could not contain. For years, Judge Thomas thrived by keeping others off balance, by wielding his robe and gavel like symbols of invincibility. But every empire of arrogance has its cracks. Every performance eventually falters. And in this courtroom, on this day, the seeds of his downfall had been sown by his own hand, by his own hubris, and by the one woman he believed he had silenced forever. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the glare of television cameras or the hushed drama of a courtroom. It began in neighborhoods where struggle was woven into the rhythm of daily life, where working families carried burdens with quiet strength, and where opportunity was something you fought for with grit and unshakable will. She was the daughter of resilience, raised by people who knew what it meant to make do with little, to stretch a dollar, to build a life in the face of indifference from those in power. Her earliest lessons weren't learned from books alone, but from watching her community endure and push forward despite being underestimated, overlooked, or ignored. As a girl, Jasmine witnessed the subtle cruelties of bias that were rarely spoken of in classrooms, but lived out every day. She saw teachers doubt the potential of students who looked like her. She overheard neighbors whisper about how politics was for them, not for us. Yet she refused to absorb that script. For every doubt cast upon her, she found a spark of determination. For every barrier, she imagined a way around it. That fire carried her through college and into law, where she made a name not for chasing prestige, but for standing with those society had cast aside. She cut her teeth in courtrooms, where the deck was always stacked, defending clients who had no one else to fight for them. Cases that wealthier attorneys wouldn't touch, that's where she sharpened her voice. Her colleagues remember her as relentless, not because she raised her voice louder than anyone else, but because she never gave up, even when the odds were impossible. She knew that in a system built to favor the powerful, perseverance itself was a form of rebellion. When she entered Congress, Jasmine brought that same grit into a chamber notorious for swallowing people whole. From the very beginning, she was underestimated. Some dismissed her as too young, too bold, too unwilling to play the game of silence and compromise. Others tried to sideline her, weaponizing stereotypes, even slurs, in attempts to shame her into invisibility. She endured hearing colleagues make comments about her hair, her tone, even her very presence, as if dignity and authority belonged to others but not to her. And yet, every time they tried to diminish her, Jasmine grew stronger. When she was called names on the House floor, she responded not with venom, but with poise that cut deeper than any insult. When political opponents tried to frame her as angry or out of place, she flipped the narrative, turning their prejudice into proof of why her voice was necessary. Each slight became a scar, but not the kind that weakens. These were the scars that fortify, that remind you of every battle you've survived. What made Jasmine different was not just her toughness, but her humility. She never forgot who she fought for. While others sought headlines, she sought justice for families torn apart by systemic failures. While colleagues chased photo ops, she spent her time in town halls, in churches, in schools, listening to people who felt the system, never listened back. To her supporters, she wasn't a politician in a distant city. She was an extension of their own fight to be heard, to be seen, to matter. And that is where the contrast with Judge Thomas becomes unmistakable. He sat on a bench of privilege, cloaked in entitlement, wielding authority like a weapon. She walked into spaces carrying the weight of her community, wielding resilience like a shield. His arrogance thrived on silencing. Her humility thrived on amplifying. He believed fear secured obedience. She believed dignity secured strength. That duality shaped every moment leading up to this courtroom clash. For Thomas, the fine was an act of dominance, a reminder of his power. For Jasmine, the fine was just another barrier, larger, more outrageous, but not unfamiliar. She had faced systemic bias before. She had been underestimated before. She had been told sit down, more times than she could count. And every time, she had refused, those scars from the courtroom battles of her legal career. From the insults hurled in Congress, from the systemic inequities she carried on her shoulders, they became her quiet preparation for this exact moment. A moment when she would once again be underestimated. A moment when she would be told, in no uncertain terms, that she didn't belong. A moment when she would once again prove them wrong. So as she sat before Judge Thomas, the weight of a $500 million fine bearing down, Her history wasn't a weakness. It was her armor. Every slight, every dismissal, every battle fought and survived had built a foundation stronger than any punishment he could conjure. And when she finally lifted her gaze to meet his, it wasn't just Jasmine Crockett staring back. It was the reflection of every voice that had ever been silenced, every fighter who had ever been told to quit, every community that had ever been underestimated. It was the stare of resilience itself, honed over a lifetime of struggle. Those scars prepared her for this very moment. A courtroom fight where everything was stacked against her. But nothing, not even $500 million, would make her break. Asterisk, the courtroom had always been Judge Thomas's stage, and now he leaned into the role with the swagger of a man who thought he was untouchable. His voice cut through the chamber, sharp and booming, layering accusation upon accusation, as if the sheer weight of his words might bury Jasmine Crockett deeper than the fine already had. He spoke of order, of respect for the bench, of consequences for those who refused to acknowledge authority. Each phrase was delivered like a lash, calculated not only to diminish Jasmine but to remind the gallery that he was still in control. Reporters scribbled frantically, capturing every syllable, while the onlookers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. There was something in the way he pressed harder, piling insult on top of penalty, that began to feel less like justice and more like vengeance. His gavel rapped again and again, each strike more aggressive than the last, as though he feared the authority of his words alone was no longer enough. Yet through it all, Jasmine remained steady. She didn't rise, didn't shout, didn't attempt to interrupt. She sat with her hands folded lightly before her, posture straight, eyes fixed on the man attempting to crush her. To some in the gallery, it looked like resignation. But to those who knew her, that stillness carried a different meaning. It was the same stillness she had shown when opponents hurled slurs across congressional chambers, when critics dismissed her as too young, when voices tried to laugh her out of the very halls she had fought to enter. It was a stillness, born not of fear, but of focus. Thomas, however, mistook her calm for weakness. Emboldened, he pressed even harder. "Congresswoman Crockett has embarrassed this institution," he thundered, his words echoing off marble walls. "She has treated this courtroom not as a place of order, but as her stage for defiance. That ends today." He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, savoring the moment as if expecting her to wilt under his glare. But the audience could feel it, the tide beginning to shift. Whispers rippled through the gallery, uncertain at first, then more pronounced. Some muttered about the extremity of his language, others exchanged knowing looks, as though realizing this was less a judicial proceeding and more a personal crusade. Even the reporters, hardened professionals used to spectacles of power, began to sense the imbalance. The judge wasn't administering justice. He was lashing out. And still, Jasmine stayed composed, letting him swing harder, letting him overextend. It was rope-a-dope in its purest form. Not resistance, not retaliation, but patience. Quiet endurance. The subtle understanding that every overreach would only expose him further. The more Thomas tried to force submission, the more he revealed his own desperation. Her silence became its own form of power. Each time he struck with words, the absence of her response sharpened the audience's attention. Every insult landed not on her, but on him, each one sounding less like authority and more like arrogance. He had mistaken dominance for respect, and in that mistake, he was unraveling. At last, the judge's tirade reached a crescendo. His face flushed, his tone rising beyond the dignity expected of a man in his position. He slammed the gavel one final time, the crack echoing like a gunshot. The room flinched, the sound vibrating through wood and marble and bone. He had spoken too much, pressed too far, revealed too clearly that this was not about discipline at all, and then silence fell across the room. The silence after Thomas's last gavel strike stretched like a taut wire, humming with tension. Reporters glanced up from their notebooks, sensing something was about to shift. Supporters in the back row leaned forward, barely breathing. At the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett slowly rose to her feet. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood with a calm that contrasted so sharply with the storm Judge Thomas had just unleashed that the room itself seemed to reset around her. For a long moment, she let the quiet linger, every second tightening the audience's focus on her. Then, with a voice firm but measured, she began. "Your Honor," she said, each syllable clear, deliberate. "You've spoken at length about order, about discipline, about respect for this court. But let us not confuse respect with submission. Let us not confuse your authority with justice." The words landed softly, but their impact was electric. A ripple moved through the crowd, as though the very air shifted. She held the judge's gaze, her eyes steady, unflinching. "You fined me $500 million? It's not because the law demanded it, not because the evidence justified it, but because you wanted to make an example of me. You wanted to silence me." Thomas straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening. For the first time, the gavel in his hand seemed less like a symbol of control and more like a shield he might need to wield. Jasmine continued, dissecting his ruling piece by piece. "You said it was about discipline, yet no statute grants you the authority to levy such a fine. You called it a matter of preserving dignity, yet your own words today, dripping with contempt, seething with personal resentment, betray the dignity you claim to defend. You spoke of protecting the reputation of this institution. But what protects an institution more, silencing dissent, or proving it can withstand dissent?" "Act!" the gallery murmured again, louder this time. A young man in the press pool scribbled furiously, underlining phrases, already imagining tomorrow's headline. Jasmine let the tension build, then shifted her ground, widening the scope. "This isn't about me, Judge Thomas. It's about every voice that's been told they are too loud, too unrefined, too unworthy of this chamber. It's about every immigrant child who grew up being told they didn't belong. It's about every woman who dared speak truth to power and was punished for it. When you punish me for standing firm, you are not disciplining a single representative. You are attempting to discipline an entire movement, a movement built on dignity, equality, and justice." She paused. The pause was surgical, deliberate. Silence wasn't empty. It was charged, alive. Judge Thomas fidgeted slightly, shifting in his chair, his hand tapping the gavel against the bench, though he didn't dare strike it. When she spoke again, her tone softened, almost intimate, as though speaking directly to the hearts of those listening. "I was raised by people who had nothing but their word, their work, and their dignity. They told me, if ever you find yourself in a room where the powerful try to silence you, don't shout louder, stand taller. Make them confront their own reflection." She gestured lightly toward Thomas, "And what I see today is not justice, but is fear. Fear that one voice, calm, unshaken, can expose the fragility of your authority." The murmurs swelled into audible gasps. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts. Even some of Thomas's usual allies in the front rows looked unsettled, shifting. Uncomfortably under the weight of her words, Jasmine pressed forward. Her voice still steady, still precise, cutting sharper than any outburst ever could. $500 million, she repeated, letting the enormity of the number hang in the air. "Do you know what that represents to the public? Not justice, not accountability. It represents excess. It represents a vendetta. It represents a man so desperate to preserve control that he weaponized the bench itself." "You don't look strong, Your Honor. You look afraid." The room erupted in a low roar of whispers and exclamations. Thomas's face tightened, a flush creeping across his cheeks. He rapped his gavel once, then again, but the strikes no longer commanded the same obedience. They sounded hollow, defensive, even panicked, and Jasmine, sensing the moment, delivered. Her crescendo: "You wanted to bury me beneath the weight of $500 million. But all you've done is uncover the truth. This isn't about law. This isn't about order. This is about power and your fear of losing it." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the chamber. "But here's the thing about fear. It can silence a person for a moment. It cannot silence a people forever." The words cracked like thunder through the silence that followed. For the first time, Judge Thomas's mask of control slipped. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darting across the room as though searching for support that wasn't there. The gavel rested useless in his hand. Around him, the gallery had transformed. Reporters scribbled with the urgency of history unfolding. Supporters nodded, some with tears in their eyes. Even skeptics could no longer deny the gravity of what had just happened. And in that moment, the courtroom no longer belonged to Thomas. It belonged to Jasmine Crockett. The judge sat back, rattled, his authority punctured in full view of the nation. And as Jasmine lowered herself back into her seat, composed and unwavering, the silence she left behind spoke louder than any verdict. But what happened next would send shockwaves far beyond those four walls. Asterisk the moment Jasmine Crockett sat down, the court recessed. But outside those walls, the fire had already been lit. Within minutes, clips of her counterattack hit social media. The silence she wielded like a blade, the calm defiance in her voice, the thunderclap of her final line. All of it was clipped, captioned, and shared with the speed of lightning. By nightfall, hashtags burned across timelines. Hashtag stand with Crockett. Hashtag judges can fall. Hashtag justice not fear. On TikTok, millions replayed the moment she looked Judge Thomas in the eye and accused him of being afraid. On Twitter, political junkies dissected her every phrase, praising her ability to turn defense into offense without ever raising her voice. On Instagram, reels of her standing tall, chin high, shoulders square, spread like wildfire, becoming a symbol of unshakable resolve. Mainstream networks scrambled to keep up. Cable news blasted split screens. On one side, Jasmine delivering her rebuke. On the other, Judge Thomas shifting in his seat, visibly rattled. Commentators tried to spin it. But even those who disagreed with her politics had to admit the optics were devastating for Thomas. He looked like the one on trial, one anchor confessed. By morning, celebrities chimed in. A-list actors praised her composure. Musicians tweeted that her words hit harder than any chorus. Athletes compared her to a fighter who absorbs blow after blow, only to rise stronger in the final round. Activists saw a symbol of endurance, while immigrant groups called her speech a rallying cry for voices long dismissed. Even some political rivals, normally quick to seize on her missteps, grudgingly acknowledged her poise. One former opponent admitted on live television, "I underestimated her. Last night proved me wrong." Meanwhile, Judge Thomas found himself in the crosshairs. Editorials questioned his impartiality. Legal scholars pored over the ruling, highlighting its excess and inconsistencies. Petitions demanding an ethics review gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures in less than 24 hours. Suddenly, the man who had tried to bury Jasmine beneath an impossible fine was the one buried under a mountain of scrutiny. And yet, this wasn't just a social media moment. Something deeper was stirring beneath the headlines and hashtags. Ordinary people, teachers, nurses, immigrants, young voters shared their own stories of being silenced, dismissed, or punished for speaking out. Jasmine's stand had become more than a courtroom drama. It had become a mirror reflecting the struggles of millions. The question was no longer whether Jasmine Crockett could survive the fine. The question was whether Judge Thomas and the system he represented could survive the waves she had unleashed. But beyond the trending hashtags, something deeper had shifted. When the noise of the headlines began to settle, Jasmine Crockett stood before a crowd of supporters outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed, microphones reached forward, but she didn't rush. She let the moment breathe, the way she had in that courtroom. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried not just her own story, but the weight of everyone who had been watching. "This was never about me," she said, her words deliberate, each syllable ringing with conviction. It was about every American who refuses to be silenced by power. It was about every person who has been told they don't belong. Every worker punished for speaking truth, every citizen dismissed because they dared to challenge authority. The crowd erupted, but Jasmine lifted her hand gently, bringing quiet back to the air. What she gave them wasn't just defiance, it was clarity, moral compass pointing true north. She explained that the fine wasn't just a number, it was a weapon. symbol meant to crush reputation, to send a message of fear. $500 million, she continued, her voice steady, was supposed to make me tremble. But what it really did was show just how afraid they are of voices like ours. Her message pierced deeper than partisan lines. Dignity, she reminded the nation, is stronger than intimidation. Calm, steadiness, and courage are stronger than chaos. When they try to bury you in noise, she declared, respond with truth. When they try to provoke you into rage, answer with resolve. That's how we win. She tied her ordeal to the greater promise of America. This country was built on a belief, she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. A belief that every voice matters. That justice is not reserved for the powerful. That freedom of speech is not a privilege for the few, but a right for all. If we abandon those ideals, we lose the very soul of America. But if we stand together, calmly, boldly, unapologetically, no gavel, no fine, no intimidation can take them from us. The crowd broke into chants, but Jasmine pressed forward, lifting the moment higher. This fight wasn't about one courtroom. It wasn't about one judge. It was about all of us. About whether we accept corruption and arrogance as the rule of law, or whether we reclaim justice as the promise of the people. Her words began circulating instantly, but more importantly, they struck something deeper in those who heard them live. She wasn't just fighting back against Thomas. She was offering a new way to understand resistance itself. Not as chaos, not as fury, but as calm. Disciplined courage that turns intimidation into exposure. Jasmine Crockett's ordeal became a parable that the mighty can be rattled, that arrogance can falter, that dignity, when held like a shield, can transform a courtroom meant to break someone into a stage where the truth is undeniable. By the time she left the podium, her supporters weren't just cheering for her. They were cheering for themselves, for the possibility that their voices, too, could rise against power and be heard. And across the country, millions who had never stepped inside a courtroom felt seen, validated, and empowered. Her final words, that day, crystallized the lesson. Never forget, fear is loud, but dignity echoes longer. Fear is loud, but justice endures. Fear is loud, but freedom, when defended, will always outlast those who try to take it. And as the chant of her name grew louder, it was clear this was no longer the story of one woman versus one judge. It had become something greater, a reminder that corruption may roar, but the human spirit, calm, unshaken, unbroken, can roar louder. Asterisk, they fined her $500 million. But she walked out of that courtroom richer in dignity than Judge Thomas could ever imagine. The number was meant to destroy her. Instead, it exposed him. What began as a ruling designed to silence Jasmine Crockett became the spark of a movement that refuses to be quiet, because in the end, this was never just about one fine, one courtroom, or one clash of personalities. It was about the larger truth. When arrogance collides with resilience, arrogance always falls. Thomas thought he could bury her beneath the weight of his authority. Instead, her calm, her clarity, and her courage flipped the balance of power before the entire nation. That is the moral of this story, and it's bigger than politics. It's about how each of us chooses to face the forces that try to silence us. Do we shrink, or do we stand tall, even when the odds seem insurmountable? Jasmine Crockett showed us the answer, and now the choice is ours. If you believe in courage, over corruption, in calm over chaos, in dignity over fear, then share this story. Be part of a community that refuses to bow to intimidation, that sees injustice not as the end of the story, but as the beginning of inspiration. Because dignity is unstoppable. It can turn a courtroom into a stage. It can turn humiliation into hope. And it can turn any country, this country, into a movement for justice, equality, and truth. So don't just watch, stand, speak, and never forget, the echo of dignity is louder than fear will ever be.